Okay, next up, we have Gordon Shotwell, who's going to be talking to us about why technical debt is a social problem.
Hi. Thank you so much for coming. So the title of this talk is Technical Debt is the Social Problem. And the reason I wanted to give that is I think, unfortunately, our community has a reputation, especially in industry, as a language that has a high amount of technical debt. I think this is actually a fairly major problem in terms of adopting R in a lot of contexts where it hasn't been adopted before. And as a community, we need to take this seriously and work on it. And I've often found myself in the position where I was kind of coming into a team or an organization, and I knew sort of what to do to pay back technical debt on that team, but I didn't actually have any sort of decision-making power over what we worked on. So I had to sort of learn to be a little bit more strategic in terms of building these more robust solutions. And the main insight that I had through this process was that it's not a technical problem, really, it's a social problem. Technical debt, for those of you who are not familiar, are basically all of the little shortcuts that we take developing things, especially under time pressure, that make the products less stable or less easy to maintain over the long term. The idea is that eventually you're going to pay that back. That's the idea. It's really the practice. And when you look at the actual artifacts that we call technical debt, they're almost always social artifacts. And I think they fall into two main categories. They're a failure of consideration or a failure of communication. Sorry, the other way around on the slide. Read the slides, don't listen to me. So communication is really just what you think about it. It's how we communicate technically with other people. So the things that fall into this category are like documentation, which is how we communicate use and purpose. Tests, which is how we communicate correctness, like what the software is meant to do precisely. And then also things like code style and project organization, how easy it is to find the thing that you're looking for in a code project, and how easy it is to understand that thing, to actually just physically read it. So those are all quite obviously, I think, things that happen between other people. We can't judge whether documentation is good or bad without knowing whether another human being who's relevant to us understands it, right? There's no like perfect communication that we can transmit to the world. What matters is whether somebody understands us. Consideration are all the things that have to do with how well your software handles things that are not problems that you have, right? Whenever we're developing software, it does a really good job of handling the problem that's in front of us, the problem that we're thinking about. But we can judge software as being kind of good or bad, robust or not, based on how it sort of handles a broader spectrum of people, right? So these are things like the code isn't robust, right? Someone throws some arguments at it that you didn't really think about, that weren't something that you would think to throw at a function, and it all falls down. It can't be updated easily. Maybe there's a lot of repetition and things need to be updated in many places, right? It doesn't solve the problems of future people or even just the problems of other people today. And then it has things like fragile dependency structures, or maybe it works on some scales, but it doesn't work at all on larger scales. So all of these are basically about how good our imagination is when we're developing these products, right? How well we can think about all the different things that somebody might conceivably throw at that, and how skilled we are at putting ourselves in other people's shoes to understand how they're going to relate to that problem, what they're going to try to solve with it, and how they're going to try to solve it. So again, these are really social problems, right? It's not so much that there's like a perfect dependency structure. It's not that there's a perfect kind of robustness. It has to do with how we're considering the needs of other people in our organization and the people who will join it in the future. So this also gives us some insight into why it's so difficult to pay technical debt back, right? Because when you realize that actually this is a problem between two people, you sort of bring in this other insight, which is that people are really kind of fickle and biased, right? So some of the biases that I think you encounter, so one of them is status quo bias. This is, of course, the 1970s UK rock band Status Quo. I'm sure it's familiar to you. So this is just that when you're when you're working with a system for long enough, right, you've paid the price of learning that system, and you've kind of gotten used to the pain you feel when you use it, right? So it's sort of all those things kind of disappear for you. And so you have this sort of bias that you kind of like the way it is, right? And you're not going to really be that interested in changing it. You're going to sort of overestimate the cost of change because you've already learned the existing thing, and nobody's learned the new things, or you're going to have to do some work to learn the new thing. The second bias is the IKEA effect. And this is one of my favorite. I love this picture because you really tell her she likes that chair. So when you build something from IKEA, basically you overestimate how good it is. So like you put something together yourself and you kind of invest a little bit of your ego into that thing. And since your ego is your favorite thing, like suddenly that thing becomes way better than everything else. I think this is a big part of why programmers tend to like building their own databases, right? Because like even if it's worse objectively than the database you could buy, like you built it, so you sort of are like, there's some pride that goes along with that. So similarly, whenever you're trying to replace something, usually you're replacing something that somebody in your organization who's still there has built, right? So they overvalue it. And lastly, it's the parenting effect. This is my daughter's first experience with spinach. And so this is, when you watch something grow up, you forgive its messes, right? You forgive the problems because you sort of see how it's sort of progressed over time, and you're like, well, it's so much better than it used to be, right? Like, they can do so much, this system can do so much more than it used to be. It's so much easier to use than it used to be. And you sort of forget about like that actually right now it's got some problems. So all of these things together, I'm sure we could think of other biases, but all of these things together means that it's never a fair contest, right? Whenever you're trying to pay back technical debt, it's not that people are going to rationally evaluate like which one is objectively a little bit better, right? When you're replacing these things, you have to do much, much better in order to get over these kinds of humps that you find within an organization. And the goal, I think, for doing that is to try to build delightful products. So something where this is sort of similar to how we relate with external users of products, right? We want to build something that actually people get excited about when they use, that they really sort of, it's a joyful experience when they use this thing. And that can mean a lot of different things. For me, like some of the things I really focus on are that it sets up in a single step, so like install.packages, right? You only have to call one thing and the setup is complete. There's a clear, obvious first problem. There's a clear way to get from the obvious first problem to something quite complicated, to be a master of that system. And then it has sort of help resources, and it doesn't break, right? It doesn't sort of just randomly stop working. So one of the products I really love that fulfills all these things is our Markdown, because especially it sort of gives you something that like right away, here's the easy thing that you can do right now, but down the road, you can just really take over all publishing. Like you can publish all the websites, all the books, right, using the same framework, and there's a smooth path to that. So building delightful products, that's the goal. And if you do that, then I think you can kind of overcome those biases. How do you build delightful products? Well, I have a 3-step plan for you. So the first one is to find the right beachhead, which is to pick your first battle in this process of paying back technical debt and pick that correctly. Second is to separate users and maintainers and to treat these internal products more like you treat external-facing products. And lastly, empathize with the debtor. So a beachhead, for those of you who are not familiar with the military things, is like when you're invading a country, you like have like a little staging area that you have to take first, right? And it's not about winning the war, but it's about like putting yourself in a position where you can deploy your resources and get supply lines and all that stuff. So finding the right beachhead is very much about like picking the right project. And so this is a picture of a piece of code base that I was working on at Socure when I was first starting. And each of these is an R script. Each of the dots is an R script. And each of the lines is a sourcing relationship between this script and another one. And Socure, at the time, was a very small data science team and has grown a lot. So this was a kind of type of way of sharing code that works really pretty well if you're like 4 or 5 people. It works less well if you're like 25 or 30 people. And there's a sort of natural tendency for myself to like look at this and say, I just need to replace this with a package, right? I need to take over all of this code and put it into one thing. And that's going to fail, right? Because there's no way that I'm going to be able to really understand what each of these things does And there's no way that actually I even know that and a lot of these things need to be around at all, right? So you have to be strategic about what you're picking. Which of these am I going to use to give me kind of something which I know I'm going to be able to accomplish, and it's also going to build trust in the organization. So some of these things I think it's really important to focus on small, contained projects and something that you can do really, really well at, right? You're trying to knock it out of the park, and it's easier to do that with a baseball than like a bag of Jell-O or an elephant or something, right? So you want to have something that's small, because mostly what's going to happen is people are going to judge it based on the delta, not so much the overall value. So it's better to do really, really well in an area of limited scope than just a little bit well in an area of big scope. It's good if it's an orphan or greenfield project, like there's nobody in the organization who's super attached to how it's like now. And if there's external pressure coming from outside of your team, that's also really great, because nobody likes to respond to that. So if you can take that on, it's really good. So in my case, what we picked there was the database access functions, right? They were small, I could understand them well, and we were responding to some external pressure from our infrastructure team to sort of change how we were storing and distributing credentials. So find the right beachhead. Put yourself in a position where you can solve this small problem and solve it well, so that you can move forward. And what this will allow you to do is develop like trust within the organization. It'll allow you to build up the social and sort of technical infrastructure that you need to solve these problems, like a CI process or just learning how to do code review with other people. The second main point is to separate users and maintainers. And this is, in order to build delightful products, you need somebody who is defining what delight means, and you need somebody who's trying to make the product do that, right? So in other words, you need a user and you need a maintainer. So ideally, every system in your team or your organization should have a written down list of who is a maintainer of that product, and everybody else is a user. These two groups abide by a basic and holy contract. That contract is that users get coddled and maintainers get opinions, right? So you have to pick one of these things. And we all want to kind of sit between these. Like we want to be coddled, and we also want to have opinions. We want to make these decisions, but we don't really want to deal with all the consequences that might happen down the road from those decisions. We don't want to write the code, but we don't want to document it or write tests. What this says is basically, we're not doing that anymore with these sort of low technical debt problems. We're going to have maintainers, we're going to have users. And if you're a user and you want to be a maintainer, you're welcome to, but you're going to get all of the other stuff that goes along with that to make sure that this product is delightful. So being a good maintainer means that you're responsible for making it delightful. That's your goal, right? You want to make this product really, really good, really, really easy to use. You want to make it a joy. With that, you have the responsibility and the authority to do that, right? So you're the decision maker over what that product does and how it does it, right? You decide how it's going to accomplish this goal, and you kind of judge yourself based on whether you're accomplishing it. So along with this means that you don't kind of ask the users to do your job for you. This comes up a lot for internal products with documentation, where the first time that we ask somebody to set up a system, and if the documentation is wrong, we ask that person to fix the documentation, when usually actually they're the worst person to document something because they understand it the least. So this is sort of something where you say, like, as a maintainer, I'm going to do all of this stuff to make sure that this thing is really good, and I'm not going to expect the user to be able to do any of the things that I should do. Being a good user is basically the opposite of this, right? You get to define what delight means. And importantly, you have to sort of turn off the part of your brain that can understand computer systems really, really well. So as developers, like, it's tempting to basically be like, oh, I have a bug with this system I don't maintain. I'm going to go read the source code and figure out what that bug is. And that's rarely a good use of your time, both because you have your own systems to maintain, and also because you're not actually fixing the problem for the sort of like lowest common denominator user, right? You want to have the feedback be like, actually, this was hard to use. I had to think hard to get this to set up. Please fix that, right? That's not delightful if I have to work too hard at it. It's also good to ask about the problem, not the solution. So rather than proposing like, you should change this technical thing in your system, say like, as a user, I have this problem, right? There's a reason why product managers use that a lot. It's a really good way of phrasing it. And it's just important to not be embarrassed about complaining about something and to really try to never read source code. So a good sort of standard is if you're asked to do like documentation, like you can give code style input, and if people like say like we're not talking about that, that means you're a user. So for instance, like sometimes I start asking like like some of these questions, and then eventually they say like I actually start talking about something else, and then I say, okay, great, I'm a user, fix your docs. So another sort of thing that comes up frequently is like I run an R package, and I often get sort of requests from various different people to put a function that they've written into that R package. And this might be a perfectly good function that solves the problem that's in front of them. But it might not be tested, it might not be consistent with the other functions, it might not be documented. So if you do that too much, you kind of end up with this sort of package, right, where you sort of like, you've made some progress, like you've lined them up, right, but it's never going to really do the job. Like doing the job of building sort of a global system that works well together and is intuitive and easy to remember, it takes a lot of work, right? You actually have to think hard about it. And unless you're a maintainer of this package, you're not really going to have the time or attention to do that, right? So the last point is to empathize with the debtor. And I think the important thing here is whenever you're doing these projects, you kind of have to like remember that what you're doing is kind of inherently threatening and sort of insulting, right? Because you're saying to somebody who has worked hard on something, right, that the thing that they've developed like doesn't work anymore, right? Or maybe it never worked, but it doesn't work anymore. And that is really a problem because you're also asking them to learn something. And when people are sort of threatened or afraid, it turns out that they can't learn anything, right? There's those two parts of your mind, like they can't work together. So you need to have people be kind of like comfortable and feel supported and understood in order to get them to change. And also in order for you to learn from them, right? Because the existing products, like they're not all bad. They've done some good jobs, right? So it's important to really like try to take their perspective to understand like where they're coming from, why does this system do things the way it does, and how can we kind of together make it better. And then more often than not, this is you, right? Like you're looking at your own projects from 2 years ago, paying back technical debt, and you kind of don't want to look at it because you feel bad about yourself, and that's unpleasant. So you never fix the tests, right? Like, so having this like, I'm kind of using this phrase to like talk about other people, but really a lot of the times it's you, right? Like you're the person on the other side of this when you have some other person coming in and saying like, this doesn't work, or you're looking at your old stuff and it doesn't work. And all this really applies in the same way, right? Like you're trying to learn a new thing, and if you feel threatened and afraid, you're not going to learn it, right? You're just going to kind of like, whatever, the docs are fine. There's this, I don't know if you're familiar with Marie Kondo, but she has this thing where you, like, if you're getting rid of your old pants, like you pick up your pants and you say, thank you, pants. Like, you covered my butt for a lot, like you did a good job, right? And then that helps you let go because you sort of like, these don't look good on me anymore, but thank you. So I really think that one way of developing this kind of empathy is to look at technical debt as a good sign. And the reason it's a good sign is because the only reason you ever care about paying back debt is if you haven't declared bankruptcy, right? So technical debt means like I haven't declared technical or regular bankruptcy, right? So there's still something there to work on, right? Otherwise I just throw it away. So you could look at all these code sort of artifacts, these things that you're like, oh, this is awful, this is really fragile, it breaks all the time, it's hard to learn, and sort of just remember that actually this is the work of like thoughtful people who are doing their best with the knowledge and resources that they have available to them. And that's really all we can ask of people. And similarly, the code, the fact that you're looking at that code or that product means that it got you to the next step, right? It did something. And that even if that thing is just basically showing you what doesn't work, right? And that's really all we can ask of these products, is just to take us one step forward so that we can like fix it, right? It's kind of a constant process of just basically fixing broken things and then breaking new things that need fixing later. So going back to this slide, basically, sorry, I was not using a timer. Going back to this slide, this code base was developed at a time when Socure was really kind of in a slight like emergency. Like we really needed a product to get to market, right? And this did that, right? We have a market-leading identity product now because of what this code did, right? Even it's a bit of a tangled mess, like it got us there, and that's why I'm here sort of talking about this. So Thank you. That's all I really have. I think it's a sort of important thing that we should focus on. We are hiring, so please talk to me if you would like to work on identity fraud. And I'm on Twitter. Thank you. Oh, sorry, that's wrong.
Thank you, Gordon. We have time for maybe one question. Regarding the user versus maintainer roles, what are tips for teams with high turnover? And then another question is, where a team has a user that is highly likely to become a future maintainer?
So for the turnover, I think basically turnover is good because the more turnover you have, the more education feedback you get. So in that sense, it's important basically like if you're able to manage high turnover, that's a good sign that you're able to educate people quickly. So that's actually kind of like a beneficial thing. For the maintainer user things, I think kind of giving people like good first projects is really helpful. One of the things that I found very helpful personally is if somebody else writes tests for me. So if you're a like senior person, the best thing you can do is write documentation or tests and have a junior person fill in the code. Like the code is actually the easiest part. Setting the expectations for what that code needs to do is the hard part.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.